نحمده ونشكره ونستعينه ونستنصره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فهو المهتد ومن يضلل فلن تجد له وليا مرشدا وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله صلى الله عليه وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. I remind you all to fear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as He should be feared in the not acceptance state of Islam, state of full submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The topic of today comes back to akhlaq, but in a much more narrower sense. So we all know the famous hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam where he says, إِنَّمَا بُعِثْتُ لِأُتَمِّمَ مَكَارِمَ الْأَخْلَاقِ. So indeed the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was sent to perfect good character. And we've spoken about this before. But there's one particular aspect of akhlaq, I'm sure there's many, but there's one in this modern society that's almost disappeared. And that's the one of modesty or shame. They're sort of interchangeable, modesty and shame, but modesty in Arabic, haya, is a very, very important part of the faith. In fact, in many scholars say al-haya'u min al-iman, and then there's an addition to that saying which we'll get into more depth later on, but it takes on from the hadith of Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam where he says, inna mimma adraka an-nasu min kalam an-nubuwwati al-ula idha lam tastahi fasna' ma shi't. So a lot of people in layman's terms when they're talking amongst each other, they say إذا لم تستحي فاصنع ما شئت, or they say ليس بعد الكفر ذنب, essentially, if they're talking in casual circles in Arabic. So the direct translation is, amongst the things that the people have found from the words of the previous prophets was, if you feel no shame, then do as you wish. So first of all, I'm going to describe for you an interpretation of Ibn al-Qayyim rahimahullah, who was a great scholar in his own right in the Middle Ages, and then we'll explore it in more depth. So he said, rahimahullah, that if a person does not have any modesty, then there's nothing to prevent him or her from doing anything. Essentially, if there are no moral bounds, then what's to stop an individual from committing sin? Or in modern society, we have things like laws, and then there's the punitive aspect. So if you don't comply with this law or this regulation, then you get a fine, you go to prison or whatever. But in terms of an actual moral obligation of doing things, it doesn't really exist. Western society in particular has a moral foundation which is, and as much as they try to deny it, has a Christian underpinning. So there's some kind of morality there, even though they keep moving further and further away from it. But you notice in particular that communist societies, because they don't believe in God, they don't have moral underpinnings, are particularly brutal. Because the only way to control a population that doesn't have a common sense of akhlaq, a common sense of morality between them, is through brute force and making sure that you scare the living daylights out of them if they even think or lift their heads up to do anything that they're not supposed to, according to the government of the day. And that's, subhanAllah, we go from like the really small, minute, everyday aspects of modesty, and then you see how it translates into in a bigger sense, whether it's a state or in a global sense. But back to this form of modesty that Ibn al-Qayyim rahimahullah is talking about, and when it comes to sins, ultimately, if you are not ashamed in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when you make a sin, what's to stop you from doing the sin? There's an element of hayat there. You do a sin, you feel bad about it. You're mustahi min Rabbil Alameen subhanahu wa ta'ala. You feel bad. You're ashamed of yourself that you dared to go against what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told you to keep away from. So hayat is at the basis of everything. And it's incredible that in this modern world, the one thing that is attacked like nothing else is modesty. And iffa, especially for ladies, iffa, modesty in all its forms, and iffa for ladies, which is kind of chastity, also spurned from modesty. Attacked incredibly. Why? Why is it attacked? There are many reasons. And one of the things I'll allude to is the fasad that we know is so accessible. I don't want to talk about it immediately, but it's led to, what's now pretty much $1 trillion industry. But we'll get to that. But honestly, when it comes to modesty and making sure that you have hayat towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this is part of being a Muslim. Ultimately, that's why the ulama said al-haya'u min al-iman. Because if you don't have hayat towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then you're not going to feel anything. If you do something wrong, who cares? So be it. And that's why one of the measures of your level of iman is how you react to small sins. What you consider small sins. Do you think to yourself, look, it was just a small sin, it's not a big deal, move on, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is forgiving. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is forgiving, yes. But that mentality is wrong. Because that mentality is a slippery slope and it's from the shaitan. Because the small sin becomes a bigger sin, and we don't want to go into the whole gateway or rabbit hole theory, but ultimately you start small and you get worse and worse. Anybody that's ever done drugs, anybody that's ever been dragged into drugs or something like that, that's always how it's happened. You start with a cigarette, then you move on to weed, and you move on to something harder, and next thing you know, you're on ice, and it's an almost impossible journey to get back. So with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when it comes to sins, this is one of the things that ulama tell us, it's actually a test of your own faith and your own connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. How badly do you feel when you commit a sin? And we all know what the kaba'ir are, so that's not what we're talking about here. We know what the major sins are. But when you commit a small sin, when you yell at someone when you shouldn't have yelled at them and you say you've broken their heart, especially if it's a family member, how to react to that? How do you react to that? Is it normal? Should you just get away with it? Do you take advantage? You're out in the street and you want something, so pretty much you intimidate the old lady in the street to make sure you get what you want? Is that okay? She may just give you what you want. You don't have to do much. But ultimately, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala trials you. And He tests you with what He's given you. So is that a big deal to you? Is that not a big deal to you? And the thing is, the Muslim subhanAllah is always in a state of reflection. And one of the advices of the things we learn from the Sahaba and the Prophet ﷺ is that every night they used to sit with themselves and almost do like an accounting of their day. So, how did I do today? Did I hurt someone that I shouldn't have? Was there something I did that I really need to make tawbah for? What kind of istighfar can I do before I sleep? All these kind of things. Muslim is always accounting for their own deeds, so that before they stand in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and get accounted for, they've already accounted for themselves. And this was the wasiyah of Umar radiallahu anh. This was the advice of Umar radiallahu anh. حاسبوا أنفسكم قبل أن تحاسبوا. So hold yourselves to account before you'll be held to account on the day of judgment. And then on that day it's too late. So in another hadith, Prophet ﷺ says, Haya and Iman are two that go together. If one is lifted, the other is also lifted. And I think through what we've just discussed, it's pretty obvious why that's the case. Because ultimately without Haya, there can't be Iman. Iman is all about being aware of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and following His obligations and keeping away from what He told us to keep away from. If you don't have the modesty and the shame from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when you don't do that, then that's simply not going to happen. And then the ulama, subhanAllah, they go deeper and they talk about natural and acquired modesty. So everyone is born on the fitrah. Every single person. And in fact, not just people, even animals. You ever seen a cat, for example, cats in particular are a good example where they won't sit there and do their business in front of you. They'll go find a place, they'll do their business, and then they'll cover it up. This is a cat. This cat has more haya, more modesty than a lot of people. And we'll get to the acquired modesty part. So ultimately, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ingrains in everyone a certain element of haya when they're born, in the fitrah, where your natural inclination. And I've seen this with my own eyes, where subhanAllah, a young girl was on the playground once. She's 3 or 4, and she was wearing a skirt. She was on the swings or whatever, and the thing went up, and she felt ashamed, so she tried to cover it back up. But then her uncle or grandfather, whoever it was with her, told her, no, you don't have nothing to be ashamed of. Don't worry about it. This is training. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put that fitrah, put that haya in that little girl, but this man took that away from her. And that's why you need the second part. Because if you're in a society that doesn't accept this normal fitrah and haya, doesn't protect it, then this is where Islam comes to make sure that we can overcome our own desires and overcome society's temptations, and gives us a roadmap on how to do that. And this is where the acquired haya is. And the acquired haya comes from the teachings of the Prophet ﷺ and following the guidelines of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this goes into a really long and age-old debate about whether people need religion to be good people, whether we need religion to tell us what to do, or what would happen if we don't have religion. I don't want to get into the philosophical debate here. That's not my job here in the khutbah. Ultimately, I'm here to tell you, and I think we've all seen it in one way or another, that without Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's guidance and us accepting those regulations, then you just have an explosion of indecency and unashamedness through the world. And one of the biggest examples of that today is an industry which is $1 trillion industry now, and that's the adult scene or the porn industry. It's $1 trillion industry, and it's all built off the primitive desires of man. Primitive desires, these are the desires that we have in common with animals. We've built a massive industry just off this one desire. And everybody that works in the industry knows exactly what they're feeding off. It's something as old as time. It's a ghariza. It's lust. And of course, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told us how to control for this very primitive desire. And He told us how to not be like animals and to be different from animals. And He gave us the aql, the mind, and consciousness, and the ability to think and make decisions so that we don't follow the same path and things become law of the jungle. Although in today's day and age you wouldn't know it, because law of the jungle is what's currently running the world. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to be with our brothers and sisters suffering through hardship, whether they be in Gaza or Sudan or everywhere throughout the Muslim world. And we see that this rules-based order we've been told, which is an attempt at having some kind of modesty or morality built into a law-based order, was merely just something to make sure that most of the people of the world, especially the global south, stick to what they're supposed to do, then the rest of the world can get away with whatever they want. Or at least people in Europe, they don't fight each other and the like. But we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to free us of this pervasive form of slavery. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to free our minds of this legacy of colonialism and allow us to move forward. Yeah, and ultimately with the attacks coming left and right when it comes to modesty, and attacks especially, and I'd like to make a shout out to the sisters here, because ultimately they bear the brunt of this one. especially if they wear a scarf and they move in public. We see all over the world the attacks on modesty, whether it's, they initially started with the niqab. They said, look, we don't want people covering their faces because it's a security risk. And then from there it moved to, it doesn't really fit in with the culture of the place. And then now it's an outright attack on hijab in many places, especially in Europe. And you see slowly that slippery slope where ultimately it's never about the rights of people or you practicing how you want to practice things and then leave them be. No. It's about taking away this very valuable thing that Islam values. And this is why, even though Islam may not be trying to be political, it's a simple statement. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala orders men to be modest and orders ladies to be modest, and part of the modesty of women is to wear the hijab. It's not a political statement, but ultimately it becomes political. No one's trying to get involved in politics. Lady walk into the shop or going to her work, whether it's in the public sector, especially in Europe, is not trying to be political. But ultimately it becomes political. And this is just like a side note. It's one of the reasons why people who think that as Muslims we can keep away or bury our heads in the sands and run away from politics, it's a futile task because it affects you directly. So you must be engaged. But on the last note, and I'll finish with this, I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to keep us steadfast, both brothers and sisters, in maintaining this gem of modesty, haya. And I just finish with this quote from the ulama where they say, Al-haya'u min al-iman wal-khajalu min al-nuqsan. This is a very important differentiation. So haya ultimately is modesty, and it's not khajal, where khajal is a deficiency is in character. So khajal is, for example, you see your brother and sister doing something wrong, but you don't approach them so that essentially you don't offend them, or out of cowardice almost. And we're not talking here embarrass them in front of everyone, but even the fact of approaching them is too much for you. This is a deficiency in character. This is different. And that's not what we're talking about. If a sister is in a bad situation, her job is not to have haya and not stop the person from attacking her. This is not haya. Ultimately, this becomes a form of khajal. Look, we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to keep all our sisters away from that kind of situation. But just to illustrate the point, there's a fine line, but there's a difference between haya and khajal, modesty and kind of being embarrassed. And we all know it. Sometimes it's a hard situation. You don't want to tell someone something. You don't want to ask someone for something. That's essentially khajal. That's different. But if it's how do I get the message across in the best way, that's different. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow us to have haya. Wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alamin. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد في الأولين وصل على سيدنا محمد في الآخرين وصل على سيدنا محمد في الملأ الأعلى إلى يوم الدين اللهم ارزقنا شفاعته وأوردنا حوضه واسقنا من يده الشريفة شربة هنيئة لا نظمأ بعدها أبدا يا رب العالمين اللهم كن مع إخواننا المستضعفين في كل مكان اللهم كن معهم ولا تكن عليهم ثبتهم وسدد رميهم وكن لهم عونا ونصيرا يا رب العالمين اللهم إنا نسألك الجنة ونعوذ بك من النار اللهم إنا نسألك الجنة ونعوذ بك من النار اللهم إنا نسألك الجنة ونعوذ بك من النار وآخر دعوانا الحمد لله رب العالمين وأنت يا